Well, after days of bombing Iranian targets, the US has paused its air campaign. Iran has responded in kind, halting retaliatory strikes against American allies across the region. The Trump administration now insists that the pause is designed to open a window for diplomacy going forward. It is a familiar playbook. Washington ramps up military strikes to force concessions, while Tehran retaliates against American assets and regional allies. Iran has also tightened its grip on global energy shipping, using Houthi forces to choke off key maritime routes in the Bab al-Mandeb. While the temporary lull renews hopes for talks, it may also signal mounting pressure on Washington, with reports indicating top officials, including Vice President J.D. Vance and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane, have raised concerns over runway escalation. General Kane reportedly warned President Trump that a prolonged campaign could dangerously drain stocks of Patriot interceptors and regional air defenses. According to assessments by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, United States has already used roughly one-third of its combined pre-war inventory of critical precision weapons during early fighting with Iran. These include THAAD, Patriot interceptors, as well as offensive missiles. Trump, however, dismissed those reports while insisting that American stockpiles remain fully loaded. According to an Axios report, U.S. CENTCOM commander has advised the White House that strikes around the Strait of Hormuz have largely met their military objectives, while warning that further bombing would yield diminishing returns. At home, gas prices are climbing as the conflict jolts global energy markets, compounding persistent inflation and even high interest rates. The Houthi blockade along critical Red Sea oil routes threatens to drive prices even higher. With less than 100 days until the U.S. midterm elections, domestic political heat is rising for Trump administration. A conflict President Trump once predicted would last 4 to 5 weeks is now stretching into its fifth month. Explaining the administration's strategy, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Mike Waltz, emphasized that while President Trump is creating space for diplomacy, American forces remain locked and loaded with all options on the table. Tehran says it will hold its fire as long as Washington does the same. However, senior Iranian sources have also expressed skepticism around this, viewing Trump's pause as a tactical maneuver than a genuine shift in U.S. negotiating policy going forward. Joining us on the broadcast from London is Chris Doyle. He's Director of Council for Arab-British Understanding and also West Asia analyst. Mr. Doyle, appreciate you joining us on the broadcast. U.S. has paused airstrikes against Iran for second consecutive night. The question is, are the two countries at an inflection point? If so, what is the reason behind the recalibration on part of the U.S. forces?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think that we have seen all of this before, but hopefully what we will get here is a realization amongst the key principal actors in all of this in the United States and Iran, and indeed elsewhere, that there really isn't going to be a military option on all of this. There is a game that's still being played as to how to move the talks into something more serious that actually leads to a final political agreement. I think the trouble is at the moment is that the tensions spill out. You get these pauses that last for maybe a week, 2 weeks, but then you get a resumption of hostilities, not to the same sort of extent as, for example, we saw in March, for sure. They are more calibrated, but it still is actually not bringing either side closer to a resolution to this. And the realistic scenario is that they both understand that this cannot continue like this forever. The United States can't afford to continue to exhaust supplies of its munitions. It can't afford the economic hit of all of this. And of course, as you said in your report, the American midterms are only 100 days away, but also for Iran. Also, if it wants to realize anything out of this conflict, it needs to be able to cash in some of the successes that it's had. It needs to get into reconstruction to obviously address the significant amount of damage that the US bombardment, the Israeli bombardment has meted out on Iran. So it too needs to get away from war and to try to build a different future. So I think it's really welcome now what you see, these Oman-mediated talks, that Oman, that has played a very significant role over the last several years, in fact. I mean, originally, even going back to the JCPOA, the 2015 deal between the United States and others with Iran on the nuclear file. So the Omanis have very significant experience in handling these two sides, in understanding US and Iranian concerns, and hopefully they can actually build on the ceasefire that was agreed, some time back, to get closer to political deal, because that's what is needed.
Right, Mr. Doyle, going back to the earlier point that you mentioned regarding Iran holding cards as of now. Now, even as the US maintains that the naval blockade remains in place in the Strait of Hormuz, the fact that an oil tanker exploded after hitting a naval mine speaks volumes about the perils of crossing the strait. Do you think US has actually smelled the coffee that Iran holds the cards as of now?
Well, they probably do, but they're not going to admit it in public. The Trump administration is not one that admits to weakness. It is still very belligerent and bullish in its public communications. But of course, I think that they all know that it hasn't panned out as intended, as expected, that the easy war that they talked about back in February just hasn't transpired. And they failed to calculate the options that were available to Iran in asymmetric horizontal warfare that allowed them to spread the cost, to inflict an economic pain on the global economy and on regional allies of the United States. So they're having to do a pretty radical rethink. The United States is not going to get, let's face it, all those objectives that it laid out at the beginning met. I think it'll probably boil down to the nuclear file, the fact that Iran is not going to be able to have a nuclear weapon. I think that will probably become the bottom line. But the ballistic missiles program, support for Hezbollah and the Houthis, those are issues I think it's going to be very hard for the United States to keep pushing on at this juncture, because simply it does not have those sort of cards to pressure Iran with that it thought it had.
Yes, Mr. Doyle, talking about the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has time and again made it absolutely clear that all vessels need to pass that designated route that has been given by the Iranian side. Do you think the US and the Iranian side need to come to a middle ground when it comes to ensuring safe passage of vessels and ensuring that those vessels only pass through that designated route?
There does need to be a compromise on this, and I think there is some room. But the Iranian side may concede a certain degree on this, but only in return for other issues in which they may get what they would see as a success. Now, Iran, for example, might allow Oman, which of course is the other maritime state that is involved in the Strait of Hormuz. Oman, with the Masandam Peninsula, controls the southern part of the Strait of Hormuz. So as long as Iran believes that it's going to get some income out of this, because it craves funding to basically pay for that reconstruction, then I think it might be malleable on some of the detail. But it wants the principle accepted that it can charge for shipping. And I don't think it's going to shift away from that. Now, the broader point, of course, until Iran has agreed on all of this, until there is a political agreement, then I'm afraid the Strait of Hormuz will remain somewhat precarious. Yes, there may be some sort of ceasefire deal in which shipping will have a greater sense of security, but it will not be 100%. You're never going to be sure in this sort of environment with the leaderships that we are dealing with that something will not flare up. So there is going to be this very much escalated
Mr. Doyle,
sense of insecurity.
Yes, point taken. All eyes will also be on that meet between Netanyahu and President Trump. If Trump does seek withdrawal of IDF troops from southern Lebanon, do you think Netanyahu at present is in a position to resist that demand that's made, if at all, by President Trump?
Well, I think that they need to at least, and this is, I think, a minimum requirement, outline some sort of path to doing that. I don't think you're going to get Netanyahu signing up to some immediate complete withdrawal from southern Lebanon. I don't think that's going to happen. If you look at the network of checkpoints that they're putting in, the way in which they've set up yellow lines, this is not an Israeli administration that is about to pull out. But they're looking at these pilot areas. I think that President Trump will want to say, please reduce the bombing, if not stop the bombing. We need to make sure this deal gets over the line. The problem is, of course, that for Netanyahu and indeed other Israeli political figures, any deal with Iran is very toxic for them politically. And we will have an election in Israel at the end of October. And, this will not go down well with the Israeli electorate. So Netanyahu will be saying, what's in it for me? Because I don't like the Iran deal.
Yes.
My electorate doesn't want to withdraw from Lebanon. What do I get in return?
Mr. Doyle, last question before we let you go. US says that the Iranian military has been decimated, but given the heavy missile and drone attack and the damages to US bases, how do you see these claims on part of the US side?
Well, I think that, both sides have been making these dramatic claims and counterclaims and so forth. I think one always has to wait for really substantive verification about this. I think certainly what is true is that the Iranians have been able to deliver strikes that the US and its allies simply did not believe it would be capable of. And that is in part because they were able to strike over such a broad area in so many different states that it made it so hard for the United States and its allies to defend such a huge area, that so many targets. So the United States, of course, has also, I think, struggled to degrade the Iranian capabilities for its ballistic missiles and drone systems, that they are well hidden in caves, in mountains, and they haven't really been able to reduce that offensive capability that Iran clearly now possesses.
Yes, Mr. Doyle, point taken, and of course remains to be seen what comes out of the meet between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And of course, if US does keep up with holding its airstrikes against Iran, for now we have to shift focus. Appreciate you speaking to WION.
Thank you so much.